Welcome to Canon Conversation number 801. Today's question, when Moses went up on the mount, met with God for 40 days, a lot of us know that he got the 10 Commandments. They're written by the finger of God. You got the 2 tablets of stone that the 10 Commandments were written on. Moses came down with them. The second commandment says, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." That's not all. It didn't take 40 days to write down the 10 Commandments. God gave him a whole bunch of other things too. Included in there was the building of the tabernacle and everything inside, and God says to Moses, "See that you make it after the pattern I have given you." Well, one thing that he included is the Holy of Holies, and in the Holy of Holies you had the mercy seat, and basically once a year the high priest would go in there on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, go into the Holy of Holies, offer the sacrifice there on the altar, meet with God there in the Holy of Holies, and then God would accept the sacrifice, provided it's what was prescribed, and then that would be the covering for Israel's sin for that year there, the Day of Atonement. And so he did that every year, once a year. Well, next to the mercy seat, on each side of the mercy seat, are images of cherubs. So an image of a cherub on each side. So, and what that is, it's a pattern of what it looks like in heaven. But God said in the second commandment, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image of any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." And then later on, in that same meeting, the 40 days, God gives Moses the commandment. He says, "See, make it like the pattern. Make sure you make it like this." God gives the commandment to Moses to make 2 cherubs, graven images, basically, of cherubs. And cherubs are creatures that God made, and they exist in heaven. So God says, don't make any graven images of anything in heaven, but make these 2 cherubs. So what is this? Is this a contradiction in God's law? Is God disobeying his own commandment? Because he said you got to make these, but then he also said you can't make any graven images of any likeness of anything in heaven. And here's something in heaven, 2 cherubs. So did God set Moses up where he had to disobey the law? Well, the answer to this, and I think the reason I wanted to make this video, is that when you look at the 10 Commandments, let's say, or anything that God says, the issue is not just a rote obedience of the commandments. The issue with all the commandments and anything that God says is he's desiring you to obey him from the heart. Later on in Amos chapter 5, verse 21, God says, I despise your solemn assemblies. He says, I will not smell, meaning I will not accept the sacrifices you give to me. Now, wait a minute. You said feast days. God says, here are the feast days. Here are the sacrifices you bring. And now God's saying that if you bring the sacrifices that are prescribed according to the commandment there, according to the law, God says he won't accept them. Well, aren't they obeying God? No, they're obeying him in form. But the reason God says he won't accept them is because they're making sacrifices to other gods. They're really, they say they're to the Lord. They're doing what it says in the feast day, but they're just honoring God with an outward show. Inwardly, they're not worshiping God. They're not serving him out of a heart of saying, you are God. I'm trusting in you to give me life in the kingdom. I know I'm a sinner. I know there's no other way that I can be saved but by your grace toward me. And so then I bring the sacrifice. That's not what they're doing. They're their heart is far from God. They don't serve God. They serve other idols. They follow their flesh. And so the form of obedience is there in bringing the sacrifices that God prescribed, but God doesn't accept them because they're not obeying from the heart. It's all with God. It's all an issue of the heart. Jesus says in Mark chapter 7, when the Pharisees said, well, tell your disciples they need to wash their hands before they eat. It's unlawful to eat with unwashed hands. Well, that was their rule. God never said that. And Jesus tells them, well, what you're doing is you're not obeying God. You're voiding out, or you're canceling out the commandments of God with your own traditions. He says, when you clean the outward, that doesn't mean you're clean. The issue is, what are you like on the inside? He says, for from within proceed, out of the heart, proceed adulteries and fornications and idolatry and all these things. What defiles the man is what comes from within, not what's on the outside. And within the heart, at least for an unbeliever, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. You've got a desperately wicked heart. And so it doesn't matter what you're doing on the outside. If your heart is wicked, you haven't recognized your sin and trusted in God to save you, well, then you don't have life in the kingdom. And so the issue is a heart thing. So when God says, don't make any, and it's sort of like, I guess a way to think about it is like, let's say I'm married and my wife wants me, she says, take out the trash. She wants me to take out the trash. And I do it. But the whole time I'm yelling and I'm cursing her and saying how much I hate her and how awful she is and that. But yet I still do it. I still take the trash out. But yet I hate her in my heart. Well, my wife's not going to be pleased with me. My wife's going to be upset with me. But you say, well, why are you upset? I don't understand it. You told me to take out the trash. I took out the trash. What's your problem? Well, the problem isn't that I didn't disobey her because she told me to take out the trash and I did it. The issue is my heart's not right. I don't love her. I'm doing it because I had to do it, not because I love her. And so she's upset with me because of that. And that's how God is. God wanted his people to love him and to recognize, when they recognize they're sinners and they trust in God to save them, the way God commended his love toward them is that he sent his son to die for their sins. And so when they believe the gospel, then Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection is applied to their soul. The blood covers their sins. And because they've accepted his love. And then as 1 John says, we love him because he first loved us. So we accept his love, and then as a result, we love God. But if all they're doing is just a rote obedience of the law, that's not serving out of love. So the issue with the sin, and because churches are legalistic, they've got rules, especially the Catholic Church. You know, it's all about, well, confess your sin to the priest, and then the priest says, okay, well, you got to pay for your sin. So you got to pray the rosary, you got to throw the Hail Mary pass, or whatever it is. You got to do these things, and once you do that, then you're absolved of your sin. So it's a work-based salvation, and that's what churchianity, all the denominations just take that, they build upon that. They clean it up a little bit, make it more subtle, but it's all about following rules. And when you don't follow rules, then you make the payment for your sin. But that's not how God designed it. God didn't give the Ten Commandments is not a list of rules for you to follow, and if you obey it on the outward, then you're okay. The issue is the heart issue. That's why Jesus said in Matthew 5, you've heard it said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill. But I say unto you, if you hate your brother without a cause, you've killed him in your heart. You've heard it said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, if you have lust in your heart after a woman, you've already committed adultery in your heart. He was showing it's a heart issue. Romans 14:23 says, whatsoever is not of faith is sin. What is the faith? Is the faith of Christ. You receive the faith of Christ the moment you believe the gospel. And so until you have believed the gospel, then all you ever do is sin. You say, well, I've never committed adultery. That was one thing. My grandfather, he was a good Bible-believing Christian, went to church for many years. Toward the end of his life, he had a stroke. And he was married to his wife till the day he died, which is, they were married 52 years. And so after he had a stroke, his body was physically where he just couldn't, his left side was paralyzed. And I just thought, he was funny. He says, you don't have to worry about me committing adultery. He says, I'm not, that's one commandment I'm going to keep. Because, in other words, he's crippled. He's paralyzed from this stroke. He's not gonna, and plus he's, in his upper 60s at the time, or maybe early 70s. He's not gonna commit adultery against his wife because physically he's not gonna be able to. And that's how people look at the commandments. It's, oh yeah, that old man, he can't commit adultery, but, guess what? He could. I'm not saying he did. He probably didn't. But, physically he could look at a woman and have lust in his heart after that woman. And he could commit adultery against his wife with that woman in his heart, even though physically he didn't do it. And a lot of us don't take that view. We don't understand that whatsoever is not of faith is sin. So when God says, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, any likeness or anything, it's an issue, it's a commandment. The way you obey that commandment is in your heart. It's basically, you don't create that image and put something before God in your mind. Yeah, it was talking about a physical thing because Israel was under a physical covenant. But the reason God didn't accept the physical sacrifices that Israel brought, even though they were according to the prescribed law of what to bring, it's because their heart was far from God. They were serving other idols. They were putting idolatry before God when they brought those sacrifices. And so the issue of the graven images, it's not, you physically break that commandment if you make a physical image, a graven image of something that's in heaven, like the cherub, but not if your heart isn't putting that there as an idol. To give you an example, look at Isaac. Remember, we said if you had hatred in your heart toward your brother without a cause, hatred without a cause, then you've killed him in your heart. Well, look at what God told Abraham. He says, take thy son, thine only son Isaac, and bring the wood, bring up there to the mountain, and offer him as a sacrifice to me. Well, the law says thou shalt not kill. And of course you could kill, in self-defense, or or maybe an accidental type thing. You wouldn't be breaking that law. But you take your own son, who's done nothing wrong. He didn't murder a bunch of people. This isn't executing justice against him. It's not executing the death penalty because he did some heinous crime. His son Isaac didn't deserve to die. And yet God says, take him and kill him on this altar. So God tells him to disobey, thou shalt not kill. And now, of course, you say, well, he didn't really kill him. Well, he killed him in his heart. Hebrews 11 tells you that. The reason God told him, stopped Abraham, he lifted up the sword and he stopped Abraham from physically killing Isaac, is because in his heart, Hebrews 11 says, he accounted him as good as dead. In his heart, Abraham killed Isaac. So Abraham obeyed God's command to kill Isaac. And so then God stopped it from happening. Well, God said, thou shalt not kill, and yet God tells him to kill Isaac. without a cause. So isn't God getting Abraham to disobey that commandment? Just like making the cherub disobeys the commandment, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. And this is a whole lot worse, because, okay, you make an image, well, you know, and it's, you know, things like that as to why Amish people won't take pictures, because it's an image, and you put a picture of your family in your house, well, then maybe you're worshiping them, and so it's like a graven image. There's also a verse about pictures in the Mosaic law that they use for that. So is that what you're doing when you take, you know, my wife went on to be with the Lord 9 months ago. I've got pictures of her in my house. But am I worshiping them? No, it's just memories of her. That's what it is. So the point is, it's a heart issue. It's not God isn't looking for rote obedience. So it's not an issue of the physical. And what God tells it, and the reason that he could kill Isaac in his heart and that wasn't breaking thou shalt not kill, is because it says that Abraham, when he did that, he reckoned that God would raise him from the dead. God said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And Isaac had not had any children yet. And so Abraham says, well, I know God's promised me that I will have, my seed will be called in Isaac, and Isaac doesn't have any seed yet. So then I know that if I kill Isaac, then God will raise him from the dead. And that's what Hebrews 11 says was going on in Abraham's mind. So, yes, as far as what we see, in his heart, Abraham killed Isaac. And the commandment is, thou shalt not kill. But yet, when you look at it from a spiritual point of view, he really was not killing Isaac, because he knew that God would have to raise him from the dead to fulfill his promise that his seed would be called in Isaac. Therefore, he only was killing him physically, but he knew that he would rise from the dead, so he's not really killing him. So it doesn't disobey the commandment, thou shalt not kill, even though just a rote obedience, just looking at the letter of the law says he would have disobeyed it. He wasn't disobeying the spirit of the law. James 2 gives an example of faith with works, with Abraham killing Isaac. And then the next example is Rahab. And she does the exact same thing. She is commended for her faith with works when she lied to the government, saying, sending the spies a different way. And another commandment, lying, saying that the spies had gone out when she'd really hidden them. So she sent the government officials away. But one of the 10 commandments is, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And that's what she did. She bore false witness to Jericho, the government officials. But the way God sees it is, spiritually speaking, is that God said, I will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. So in other words, there is the commandment, and Galatians 3 tells you the law is our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith has come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. So that Mosaic law was given to Israel not so that they would obey it, but so that they would disobey it, and they would learn the lesson of the law, which is they are sinners, and then they would trust in God to save them. And then they would not be under that law. Once they receive the salvation, then they're not under that law anymore. Instead, they serve God out of a circumcised heart, His Spirit put within them under that new covenant. So the issue isn't a rote obedience of the law. The issue is learning that you are a sinner, and then you have faith, and then when you have faith, then you're not sinning. Because remember Romans 14:23, whatsoever is not of faith is sin. So if it is of faith, then it's not sin. Even though it may disobey the letter of the law, what God is concerned about is not the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. So Rahab had faith in God's promise that God would bless Israel, bless those who bless Israel. And so she wasn't under the law of thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And so that was a faith with works thing, just like with Abraham offering Isaac upon the altar. Both are examples of faith with works, but they're disobeying the law. But that's okay because they're not under the law because they have faith. So when it comes to the graven images, if God, it's perfectly okay for God to command them to build the cherubs, because the cherubs are a pattern of the real cherubs in heaven. That mercy seat is a pattern so that God could meet with Israel there. And so then he could be a covering for their sin for that year on the Day of Atonement. And so the purpose of the cherubs isn't to bow down and worship them or making those graven images your God, but it is to bring, it is an obedience out of a heart of faith, that now there's a pattern of the heavenly that will point Israel to the fact that they need to go to God for forgiveness of sin. And so, yeah, making the cherubs disobeys the commandment in the letter of the law, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. But God's never concerned about the letter. He's concerned about the spirit. And so in the spirit of the law, it was not broken because making those graven images of the cherubs was out of a heart of faith, just like it was for Abraham to kill Isaac and for Rahab to lie to her neighbor, the government. Thanks for watching.